Hello, Israel's Titleist, the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Keith Preston. This is our fourth and final installment of Keith's vision of Pan-Anarchism. So today is going to be the hard question, national defense. So I think we'll open up with you, Keith. Why don't you describe why this is the hard question?
Well, the issue of how a stateless society would defend itself from external invaders is probably the most difficult question that anarchists or libertarians or whatever of any kind face, because if you have a society that would simply be a sitting duck for whatever kind of invasion force happened to come around, obviously that's not going to be a very durable society. So that's the first problem. The second issue is that of all the things that the state does, probably the one thing that is most commonly considered to be a legitimate state function is the provision of territorial defense. I mean, whether it's a nation state or whether it's a royal realm or whether it's a transnational federation or whatever, but people who agree on nothing else about politics frequently agree that territorial defense is a legitimate state function. In fact, there are many libertarians who believe that the state should do nothing else but provide for territorial defense. So it's certainly a serious issue if you're going to issue a challenge to that claim that even the provision of territorial defense is an illegitimate state function. So there's the practical argument, there's the wider theoretical argument, and of course, if you make the argument that state provision of territorial defense is illegitimate, then there's the question, well, who is going to provide territorial defense, and how effective is this going to be, and how's it going to be organized, and how's it going to be funded and paid for? Those are the big questions. David Friedman, who was an anarcho-capitalist theoretician way back in the early 70s, wrote a book called The Machinery of Freedom, where he talked about this. He actually talked about how this is what he called the hard question, and that is, how do you have territorial defense without a state? And of course, there are many libertarians who stop at that point and say, well, no, we have to have territorial defense provided by the state, even if they think the state should be doing nothing else. And in fact, most people from the left as well, even except for the factions of the left that are complete pacifists, even a lot of the hard left believes that the military defense is a legitimate state function as well. So if you're going to challenge that claim, which is a almost universally held claim, then you obviously have to be able to back it up with solid arguments, facts, and information.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I had a debate with Bob Murphy on that topic a year or two ago. I think that let's start with the Army, the ground forces. I would envision something along the lines of mutually overlapping militias, with basically the example that David Friedman gives. You have mutually overlapping militias with a small professional army. Basically, he's saying that the small professional army would be something like what you'd see in PMCs, private military contractors. Does that sound like something that you're envisioning, or if it isn't, how would it differ?
Well, that's a possibility, but I think a bigger question is you have to understand that military decision-making is in large part based on geopolitical circumstances. A stateless territory or an anarchist society or whatever you want to call it that emerged would emerge in a particular set of geopolitical circumstances. And we can look at past situations like this, including some of the ones that many anarchists point to as models. The Spanish Civil War, where anarchists gained control of several major cities in Spain, or the Ukraine during the Russian Civil War, or the Shimen region of Korea in the 1930s, and there are other examples that many anarchists are familiar with. More recent examples include the Rojava enclave in Syria and the Kurdish territory, and also the independent autonomous communities run by the EZLN, the Zapatistas in Mexico, and some other Mexican territories as well. So a lot of anarchists point to these as models, but all of these models emerged in different geopolitical and cultural and other contexts. frequently these kinds of situations emerge in the midst of a civil war, and often they don't have a great deal of durability in a situation like that. A good example was the Spanish anarchists in the 1930s. They were fighting what amounted to a three-front war against the communists, the Francistas, and against the Republic. Not surprisingly, that didn't turn out very well for them. The same thing with the Ukraine movement under Nestor Mako. They were essentially fighting the Bolshevik state as well as the White Russians as well, so another difficulty. And something similar has happened with Syria, in the sense that the Syrians are the PKK influenced groups, the Kurdish groups, are in a similar situation where there's, you have the major powers that have been involved in Syria, like America and Russia, and then you've got the other regional powers like Iran and Israel and Turkey, and then you've got all of the Syrian state itself and all the different rebel groups and jihadis and all of that. So they're right there caught in the midst of all this chaos. And as a general rule, I would not expect an anarchist army, or whatever you want to call it, to perform very well in a circumstance like that. Not unless they had a really large mass movement of many millions of people who were committed to the cause and something like that. There have, however, been anarchist enclaves or quasi-anarchist enclaves that have been much more durable. And a good example is what has happened in southern Mexico with the Mares. They've now been around for 25 years this month as largely autonomous communities, even though they're theoretically within the Mexican state. And the reason for that is that Mexico was essentially a failed state. I mean, Mexico was a very weak state that has trouble maintaining control over large amounts of its own territory. There are regions of Mexico that are in a de facto civil war era, but it's not the kind of all-encompassing civil war like there was in Syria, like there was in Spain, or like there was in Russia. So in a situation like this, I think it's going to be easier for an anarchist territory to emerge. We have a state that's either very weak or crumbling, but it has where the whole society has not become completely unraveled. That's the best bet for anarchists. Now, in terms of organizing an army, we see plenty of examples from all over the world, from today and past times, of groups outside the state organizing an army. In fact, that used to be the norm. Prior to the Treaty of Westphalia, at the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, you had all kinds of people waging war and organizing armies for all kinds of reasons. You had the church, the Pope once had his own armies. Families would have their own armies. Cities would have their own armies. Feudal fiefdoms would have their own armies. So organizing military forces independently of the state has something that it's been around since time immemorial. And even in the modern world, we can look all around the world and see all kinds of groups that have emerged largely independently of the state that did have a fighting force. Some of the groups I've already mentioned, some of these anarchist rebel groups, but there's plenty of others that weren't anarchists. We can look at, for example, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which has actually repelled Israel from southern Lebanon twice. Or we can look at a lot of the guerrilla insurgent groups that have existed in Latin America, the Shining Path, the FARC, the Sandinistas, the FMLN, Fuerza Mati National Liberation Front. We can look at all of the well-known examples from Asia, the Viet Cong, and all this kind of stuff. So there's, or during the apartheid era in South Africa, you had the ANC-oriented influence groups, and there are tons of groups like that throughout Africa. So plenty of examples exist for people forming armies outside of the state. That by itself is not an immediately serious problem. The question is, how effective are these kinds of organizations going to be when it comes to actually fighting? And a parallel question is, how do you keep them from becoming a new state? And many of these groups I just described are simply a new state in waiting. That's their goal. They want to be the state or take over the existing state. So that's really the two big questions. Now, in terms of how well an anarchist or non-state organized army will fight, that depends on a huge range of factors. There's as many variables there as when there are state armies. I mean, when it comes to the question of, well, how well is a state organized army going to fight? Well, that depends on all kinds of things. It depends on the state in question, what kind of leadership it has, what caliber of personnel they have in their fighting forces, how motivated their personnel are, what they're fighting for, how they're compensated, the various geopolitical circumstances involved, who the enemy is, who's leading the enemy. All of these kinds of things determine the outcome of military confrontations between state armies, and the same would be true with non-state armies. If you look at all the non-state armies that have existed around the world, some of them have done very well, some of them have done very poorly, some are so-so, and you can, in each case, you can identify all kinds of variables. Well, they had good leadership. If they were largely successful, they had good leaders who knew what they were doing, or they had crummy leaders, so they didn't turn out so well, or the people involved were not motivated to fight, or the enemy was simply overwhelming, or the enemy was very weak, or just the set of social and cultural economic circumstances was such that they had the masses of the people behind them, or they didn't have the masses of the people behind them. So all of these things determine how well an army will perform, whether it's a state army, whether it's an anarchist army, whether it's a non-state, non-anarchist army. Now, you also have the issue, though, in terms of just the sheer formation of it. I would think that in a non-state territory, there's any number of ways the defense army could be organized. It could be something like an all-volunteer militia organization, a glorified version of the volunteer fire departments and things like that you have in different communities in the United States as a long-standing American tradition. You could have defense forces that essentially functioned as businesses. They were kind of like mercenaries. They sell their services to whomever they are involved in. You could have others that were not necessarily standing armies, but were simply organized through other kinds of civic organizations. Now, one thing that I think would happen in a stateless society is that other kinds of institutions would be strengthened, not weakened, because all the things that people are currently dependent on for the state they would have to get somewhere else. Things like environmental cleanup, consumer protection, constructing or maintaining transportation systems. So the absence of the state doesn't mean there's not going to be any organizations or any institutions. It means it's actually probably going to strengthen a lot of other organizations and institutions. They may not assume necessarily the same form they do under the state, but we're still going to have them. So my guess is that through institutions of that type, you would actually have an organized defense force as well, if there was enough perception of need for such. One thing that's interesting about the United States or North America or whatever we want to call it is, because when we talk about these things, we have to talk about the geopolitical circumstances. But North America is probably the easiest place in the world to defend from military aggression, given that you have, in the case of the United States, a nation, weak nations to the north and south, no other major powers in the hemisphere, huge oceans to the east and west, and unprecedented levels of wealth and technology and military equipment. The United States was the one country in history that, if ever it could have achieved peace for itself just by minding its own business, it would have been the one. And as we know, it didn't turn out that way. But again, a military defense of North America might be much different than military defense of somewhere in Central Africa or the Korean Peninsula or an enclave in Russia or something like that. So all of that kind of thing is going to be dependent on all of these variables. But there's many different kinds of ways in which a non-state army can be organized.
Mm-hmm. One thing that also needs to be pointed out is, from what I can tell, most anarchists would assume that the defense services would be defensive primarily, first and foremost. So no wars of imperialism. Preemptive strikes may or may not be recommended depending on various conditions or moral values of the anarchists. But another aspect, too, it would be that as far as weapon systems, due to the lack, as we mentioned earlier in an earlier episode, of a military-industrial complex, there would be certain kinds of weapons that probably wouldn't be produced because the material conditions aren't there. And furthermore, they wouldn't be produced for moral objections. So, for example, nuclear weapons would often, I would imagine, would violate many of the principles of anarchism. You're just going to wipe out millions of people indiscriminately. So that would also have to be considered. So I think for the army, right, you would see something more defensive oriented. So maybe as an armed forces example, something you might see in Sweden or Switzerland, because they don't have a lot of imperialist technology like large bomber forces to bomb the enemy, or large, Switzerland's landlocked, but Sweden doesn't have a large navy. It's only really suitable for defending its own shores. So would you think that those would be good examples of how an anarchist military army might organize itself?
Yeah, well, the idea of an anarchist military force that becomes imperialistic is a contradiction in terms. I mean, it's no longer anarchist if it's doing that, it's something else. Now, I think the main barrier to that, though, would be cultural rather than institutional per se. I think a lot of discussion that I hear about this kind of issue from left and right anarchists tends to emphasize the political and the economic. But I think that a real restraining force on military aggression in a society is cultural. A good example from the system we have is, what is it that actually keeps the generals, the top brass in the military and the Pentagon from just taking over the government and saying, well, we don't want anything to do with civilian government anymore. We're just going to have a military dictatorship. What keeps them from doing that is a deep, very deeply ingrained, centuries-long tradition of civilian government that even the generals and admirals and top brass of the military, even a lot of them believe in that. They think that's the way it should be as well. Now, that's not true in some places. In some countries, they've had one military coup after another because they don't have a tradition of civilian government. In fact, in one of the African countries at one point, they had so many coups that initially they formed a new civilian government. They wrote in the Constitution, coups are illegal. And of course, that government was overthrown by a coup. So again, if you don't have any kind of social or cultural barriers to this, it doesn't really matter what your institutional structures are. But yeah, I think that certainly a society where anarchists were the most influential political sector would be one where any kind of military activity would be defensive in nature. As far as the nuclear weapons thing, obviously that's problematic from a point of view of any kind of libertarian or anarchist position. I suppose theoretically you could have an anarchist territory that has its own nuclear arsenal that's maintained somehow, probably one that was seized from a pre-existing state. So I wouldn't say that's impossible. Again, problematic from a theoretical perspective, but not impossible from a practical perspective. But you wouldn't have a state apparatus that had the capabilities for organizing the kind of mass weaponry that we see today. I think that's the main point you're making, and and I would concur with that. If you had a defense force in a society that did not have conscription available, mandatory military service, and did not have taxation available, where you can't just take money from the public and amass large sums of weaponry with it, then yeah, that does place certain limits on the war-making powers of whatever kind of institutions you do have. And I think that's a good thing. That's how it should be. There should be disincentives to that. The question is, are there going to be so many disincentives that you can't have any kind of defense at all, and that there's going to, and are they going to be, are going to be overrun by invaders as a result? But say in somewhere like North America, I think, yeah, the orientation would be towards defending the coastal areas against land invasions. Say other powers might sail aircraft carriers up and do a land invasion or something like that. I think naval defense would be something that would be very important for a stateless territory that was surrounded by water. Now, I don't mean have a mass navy like Her Majesty's Royal Fleet or whatever. I'm talking about things like you might have to have submarines and artillery and things like that are capable of repelling enemy naval vessels. So that would probably be a big emphasis. In fact, most libertarian-minded thinkers who've talked about this that I have read seem to concur with that. They seem to concur that for a society like the United States, which is surrounded by these massive oceans, naval defense would really be the big thing. And there seems to be a strong emphasis on something like submarine defense, that use of submarines would be a primary factor. I know Carl Hess used to make that argument. He was a former member of the Republican National Committee and a speech writer for Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater and some other prominent Republican politicians from that time. But he eventually became an anarchist, but he actually made that argument as well based on because he had a fairly intricate knowledge of the military industrial complex and being part of that circle. But he was saying, yeah, the real defense needs of the United States involve naval defense through submarines and things like that. So but again, it would be different for a landlocked territory. For something like somewhere like Russia, it might be much different. So they historically have had more problems with land invasions and things like that. So again, it depends on the circumstances.
It would seem to me that if you look at let's use North America, for example, since that's more likely to have a decentralized libertarian / anarchist society, that the anarchist strategy would be a strategy of denial. So for example, oddly enough, due to the Cold War experience of the Soviet Union, due to the overwhelming naval and air superiority of the United States, Soviet naval and air doctrine was one of the denial. You would deny the enemy access to your space. Now, on land, it was the Soviets that had the preponderance of resources, so it was the NATO forces that relied more on denial to deny the Soviets access to West Germany. But I think that what that would look like is that on land, you'd see lots of landmines, rockets, missiles, things that are relatively cheap, that are force multipliers that deny the territory to enemy forces. You'd see probably lots of surface-to-air missiles, because surface-to-air missiles would deny access to air power. Plus, they're relatively cheaper compared to maintaining a fleet of F-16s. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, territorial defense in terms of land would function the same way as naval defense and also air defense. You know, and all the examples you gave were examples of how any kind of society, and this would apply to a state society as well as a non-state society, but how they would defend themselves against actual invaders if the purpose was actual defense. You know, the American military system and foreign policy apparatus obviously is set up for empire building. It's not set up for defense. But I mean, if it was set up for defense, it would have to be totally reorganized. But yeah, to prevent land invaders, you know, in the Middle Ages they used to dig moats and stuff like that. You know, the modern equivalent of that would be to have a long stretch of landmine territories. You know, not to go Donald Trump here, but you might actually build a wall around your territory or something, like the Great Wall of China or the Great Wall of Trump or whatever. But another thing would be anti-aircraft artillery would be a big thing. It would be very difficult for an anarchist territory to have a large-scale air force because of the technological factors and expense that's involved in that. That means that anti-aircraft artillery would have to make up for that difference, and also perhaps short-range missiles like ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles, and things like that that are capable of taking down incoming aircraft. In fact, I think that's actually one of the main vulnerabilities that a stateless territory would have. And that is, if you were attacked by air power by a powerful state. Deterring that is a problem. And of course, that's what the United States does internationally. The United States generally prefers air power over land power, and in part because they take fewer casualties. The American side takes fewer casualties that way. So they typically prefer air power over land power, land invasions, and that's what they do to other countries. They try to just bomb the crap out of them, and you know, they inflict a lot of destruction doing that and kill a lot of people, although it still doesn't seem to produce much in terms of actual military victory. But I guess in some instances maybe the goal is just destruction for its own sake. So they're good at that. But deterring that would be a problem. It would be a military problem that a stateless society or decentralized society, a society with very limited government would have. It's going to be difficult to have something akin to the U.S. Air Force without the state. So yeah, and I think there should be a disincentive to that, by the way. But so it's going to have to be compensated for as necessary, depending on the geopolitical issues involved.
Yeah, I just don't see an anarchist society being able to muster the resources to build even an air force for defense, which is primarily based on interceptors rather than bombers. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, an F-16 is like $1 billion. It's hugely expensive. So I think something more like a deterrence like that would work. And of course, that was why the United States invented the stealth bomber in the first place. The Soviet airspace was so dense with radar and missiles that any conventional aircraft would get shot to pieces before it got to the target. Now, stealth bombers would pose a problem, but again, that would be the case, I guess, for even a state military. But for the Navy, which is interesting because when you look at, this is important because there's an essay in The Myth of National Defense about how libertarians would provide naval services to protect the country. Now, ultimately, this is where it gets a bit harder, I think, for the libertarian, because on the naval warfare has a different set of rules than land warfare. And technically, well, land warfare, you don't necessarily need a tank to deter a tank. You have landmines and missiles that'll often deter tanks. Whereas if the enemy's got a capital ship, it generally takes another capital ship to deter another capital ship. For example, Germany in 2 world wars really didn't have a lot of capital ships. They relied primarily on U-boats and submarine warfare to strangle Great Britain. And it failed in both world wars. And I can't think of any historical naval conflict where the side without capital ships was able to successfully defend its coast from the one that did have capital ships. And this is where I think it becomes a little more difficult for libertarians, because while we can find historical examples of militias defeating professional armies, we can find examples of deterrence on land working against the enemy attacks. I think it's going to be a lot harder on the high seas, and I wonder how. And for example, if it turns out you would need aircraft carriers to deter enemy invasion, I don't know if anarchists could build one. And if it didn't take an aircraft carrier, I'd be hard pressed to figure out what kind of alternatives to aircraft battle fleets could deter an invasion of a state power that had such weapon systems.
Well, there's several issues there. One thing I would point out is that the majority of anarchists do not believe that an anarchist society is something that's going to just be built from scratch. Like there's an old saying that the Wobblies, the IWW, used to have, which is the idea that we are building this new society within the shell of the old. And what they were talking about industry. They were talking about heavy industry. They were basically what that meant is, well, we're not going to do away with industrial society or build industrial society from scratch. We're just going to take over the existing industrial society and organize it in a different way for different purposes. That was the theory behind anarcho-syndicalism. And even Marxism to some degree is based on a theory like that. So I think that when an anarchist society started to emerge, you would have the pre-existing military apparatus of the older society already there. And which means it would probably dissolve somehow. Either the troops would defect to the side of the revolutionaries, or they would just go on strike, go home, or it would fracture or something like that. So it's interesting to consider what would happen if you had this Pan-Anarchist Federation that carried out a revolution in North America tomorrow, and then all of a sudden, say the U.S. Armed Forces went away, but then you still had all these military bases and planes and equipment and nuclear silos and naval vessels and all of that, tanks and all of that stuff was still there. What would you do with all that stuff? Would you just let it rust or whatever? So I think that quite likely what would happen is that you would have, that stuff would essentially be commandeered, just like in the Spanish Civil War, the unions took over the means of production and the peasant organizations took over the plantations. Most likely you would have a similar thing happen with the military. You might have the anarchist federations or soldiers' councils or whatever take over the military. So it's not like all of that would just disappear and all of a sudden you're living in the mountains somewhere and you're trying to build a military out of rocks and wood or something like that. That's not what most anarchists envision. So I think that what would you do with pre-existing equipment of this type? And then there's a question of, well, how would you maintain it? If you decided some of this stuff was necessary and you wanted to use it for a future anarchist defense force or whatever, how would you go about maintaining it? And that's where your associations of technical workers and scientific specialists and all of that who engage in that kind of work, that's where they come in. And then, of course, there's a question of funding. Is there going to be resources available for this? If nobody wants to contribute resources voluntarily, okay, you can't use taxation. That's not anarchist. So where are you going to get resources? And if there's not enough incentive for anyone to contribute, either collectively or individually, either organizations or individuals, then you may have to denounce some of this kind of stuff, which in some ways is a good thing because, again, there's this incentive to massing weapons and things like that. So that's one issue. Now, when it comes to naval defense, though, I tend to think that probably the most common naval defense, aside from, say, having things like artillery that's based on land, that's shooting out into the water, or maintaining submarines and things like that, assuming that that's proves to be technologically feasible. I tend to think good old-fashioned terrorism is probably how you would deter naval attacks, in the sense that you basically would have a defense force, kind of like pirates. Essentially, they were doing these kind of sea guerrilla attacks. A good example of this is what happened to the ship, the American ship, the USS Cole, back in the year 2000. This was an American ship in the Persian Gulf that was actually sunk or destroyed by a terrorist attack, where it was, now this was a suicide bombing, but it's just as probable you could take something like small boats and load them up with dynamite and explosives and send them out to attack ships in that way. And that this was actually a major American ship that was taken down by just a jihadi on a suicide mission on this little boat with some explosives.
I just want to add something real quick to strengthen this argument. Is sometime after the Cole incident, there were some Army-Navy war games against terrorist forces in the littoral brown water region. And the Marine General Riper basically just used a bunch of terrorist suicide rubber dinghies. And they just ended up sinking, half the U.S. fleet that was in port. And they stopped the game and restarted it, saying you can't do that.
Yeah. Well, one advantage that guerrillas and terrorists and all that have is that they're more maneuverable. They're not dealing with some big cumbersome bureaucracy and things like that. I mean, even things like the Somali pirates, they're about as ragtag as you can possibly be, and yet they still manage to terrorize the Mediterranean, in spite of the naval power of the United States and other in the NATO countries and all of that. So there's certainly, where there's a will, there's a way with some of these kinds of things. But, the big question is long-term efficiency and effectiveness over time. And at what cost? The one question is, do you really want to live in a world where there's constant terrorism on the high seas, with small boats exploding underneath big ships and things like that?
From looking at the North American example again, I think where the libertarians do get something right is with privateers. Historically, during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, the largest warship that could be privately built and maintained was a frigate. And that was beginning to push the limits. They tended to prefer things like sloops. Now, modern day times, you could conceivably build cruisers. I doubt you could do battleships or carriers, but I think a combination of submarines, cruisers, and land-based missile batteries. So submarines can launch missiles from underwater. The Soviets pioneered that with the Oscar submarine. And then, of course, you've got the classic torpedo. And then you've got missile cruisers, again, something the Soviets pioneered, where you just have gobs of missiles on these cruisers, and they just overwhelm an enemy fleet with missiles. Because even the Aegis cruiser, while it's a closely guarded state secret, has a certain limit at which you can't shoot down all the missiles. And if you have enough missiles, you'll penetrate the Aegis defense shield, sink the cruiser, and then the rest of the carrier battle group is vulnerable. So, for example, a lot of war game scenarios revolving around the Straits of Hormuz, where people are afraid Iran might choke off the oil supply, it's very close to land. And with modern Soviet Russian anti-ship missiles, the Iranians could have a really good chance of just decimating any fleet in the region from shore-based batteries. So a combination of shore-based missile batteries, missile cruisers, and submarines could theoretically create a no-go zone. Because certainly Iran doesn't have a Navy to speak of, and yet military planners in the U.S. Navy are highly concerned about their shore-based missile batteries in the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, well, I think that's fits into a wider strategic paradigm that would have to be used in a situation like this, and that is you want to be able to deter an attack in the first place. I don't really envision anarchist armies generally being that effective in terms of full-on warfare, combat of the type that you find in major wars. And not that you should want that anyway, because even if you win, at what cost? Like the Viet Cong won the Vietnam War, but at what cost? So that's something to consider. So deterrence is a big thing, and I think that what you're talking about, land-based missiles and submarines and all of that kind of stuff, landmines around your vulnerable periphery and all of that kind of stuff. That's the kind of approach you would have to have if your focus is simply on deterrence.
Yeah, which is interestingly enough, given that while politically the Soviet Union is the polar opposite of any sort of libertarian anarchist society, this is where a lot of their geostrategy and strategy might be helpful for anarchists because they sort of pioneered the idea of airspace denial and naval denial. I mean, to some extent, the Germans in World War I and World War II dealt with that a little bit with their U-boats. But again, I don't think they had the resources to go to explore it as fully as the Soviets would later do. And also, I think in a broader anarchist policy, I think we'd both agree that anarchists would, at least for a time, have to share space with other nation states. And to the extent that they share space with other nation states, once you have an area that's a stateless region, and they are able to then have their own resources to then use for defense, I would imagine they probably also begin funding other stateless society movements across the world and engage in a sort of, in the same way that jihadis, say like in Afghanistan in the 1980s, you had people coming from all over the Middle East to fight the Soviets. You would have anarchists being organized in that same sort of revolutionary way, where if there's an anarchist revolutionary struggle in Mexico, they would come from all over the world to volunteer to fight against that particular government. And once enough of these regimes start developing and they were able to deny access to the government, it'd be a struggle of denial. So we got resources, you got resources, but we're denying you the resources you need to run your first world military industrial complex.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you give the Soviet example because I think I mentioned this guy on one podcast we did, not this series, but one of our others. There was a guy named Miles Copeland who was a CIA operative and an analyst who had been involved in a lot of covert actions. In fact, he was one of the figures involved in the coup against Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. Miles Copeland. He was probably actually more well known for being the father of the guys that formed the band, the Police. Like one of his kids was in that group. But Miles Copeland was unlike a lot of other American political figures in that he was much more candid. He said in an interview once, he says, well, look, because this was when the Cold War was going on and still was going on in the 80s. He said, look, this is what the Cold War is about. We, the Americans, we want all these this wealth that all these developing countries have, minerals and natural resources and all of that. The Soviets are trying to keep us from getting to it. That's their strategy. Their strategy is to keep us from getting what we want. So yeah, you're right. That was their strategy, the Soviets' strategy of denial. And I think that would have to be very much the strategy of an anarchist polity or whatever, in the sense that you want to keep the enemy from achieving its own objectives. You talk about people like the jihadis going from all over the world to fight in different places. Well, that actually happened in Kurdistan. That's happened in the Kurdish territories. And there have actually been American anarchists who've actually gone there and fought there. And I think some were killed, and I think some from Europe too that happened. And that's happened in Mexico as well. There have actually been Americans who went there. In fact, there was an anarchist journalist who was killed there some years ago, probably about 15 years or so ago. So yeah, you would find that. I think you'd see the proliferation of a lot of these different kinds of territories that were in terms, in anarchist terms, they were engaged in mutual aid against each other or with each other against these common enemies. And then there's also the interesting question of what kind of relationship would they actually have with states. For instance, one thing the Kurds have actually been criticized for is being aligned with states at various times. And they've actually done that. At one point, they were aligned with Assad. At one point, they were aligned with the Americans. At one point, they were aligned with the Russians. And they keep going back and forth with all of this, depending on what's advantageous at the time. Now, I tend to think that's a necessity. There's just no way around that. If you want to survive, you do what you got to do. But I think you might actually find situations where you did have anarchist territories and armies and guerrillas and militias and all that did get at least peripheral assistance from states to use against other states. A good example, again, is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in Lebanon, which is a weak state, a de facto, I wouldn't say it's a failed state, but it's not a strong state. And Hezbollah has actually taken over really southern Lebanon and become the de facto government of southern Lebanon. And even in the Lebanese state itself, Hezbollah is the de facto national defense force of Lebanon. So Lebanon is really more Hezbollah than the Lebanese state, or at least much of it is. And yet, so you have a system, a non-state system that's developed within the context of a state, even though the state still stands, which is similar to what has been done in Mexico, in southern Mexico. And then you also have a situation where you have a non-state force that's actually supplanted a state, but also receives aid from states. Hezbollah receives aid from Iran, from Syria. I think they claim they don't, but they obviously do. So you might have that kind of a situation as well. And then, of course, that gets into this question of when, if ever, should anarchists collaborate with states? And there are, of course, some anarchists who are adamant that no, under no circumstances do we ever do that. And they'll say, what about what happened in Spain when the anarchists joined the Republic? That was a serious mistake, and arguably it was. And then the Kurds get criticized for the same reason. In fact, even in Mexico, they've been criticized on similar grounds. I tend to be a pragmatist about these kinds of things. So I tend to look at it like, okay, well, what's the best option you have given your choices? But it would be an issue, certainly.
Yeah. One other thing that I've noticed about modern warfare that would probably be important to take note of for anarchists. So, for example, tank warfare is most efficient in flat terrain. Basically, they're modern cavalry, they're mechanized cavalry. And like cavalry of old, you need to fight on flat territory. So, for example, in a lot of those hypothetical Cold War turns hot thrillers that people write, one book written by Hackett, a British general, called I think the Third World War, mentions that when the West German modernization and industrialization after World War II, leading to the urbanization of the North German plain, made tank warfare much more difficult because there's not a lot of this open terrain anymore. And of course, urban environments are notoriously difficult to fight in. And so tanks would be useless there. They have to be funneled in between these urban centers, which would essentially be kill zones for missiles. And so 100-killer groups were decimating Soviet tank columns in this particular story. And so if we assume that, say like Noam Chomsky does for anarcho-syndicalism, and certainly libertarians would, this would be a highly urban society, it would make it more difficult for large-scale tank warfare. As we saw in Chechnya, I mean, the first Chechen war was a disaster for the Russians. The Chechens, I mean, this is kind of incredible. In 96, the Chechens actually defeated the Russian army and drove it out because they were unable to fight in urban areas or in mountainous terrain. And then second of all, in the war on terror, as the Americans have learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, in certain war games, again with Riper, is if you engage in cities or mountains or rough terrain, the technological advantage that you have goes way down because it's just one guy with a rifle against another guy with a rifle, and tanks and bombers are not as big of an issue anymore. So rough terrain and urbanization, because urban combat is just one man versus one man, things like Stalingrad or Verdun, it really sort of levels the playing field, which is exactly what anarchists would need to do if they wanted to defend themselves against a large-scale invasion. So those are some thoughts that I think might be interesting to consider from a national defense perspective for anarchists.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that can actually be learned about this from Iraq and Afghanistan, the American experience there, but also the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. And that is when the war in Afghanistan started, the American war in October of 2001, I remember thinking at the time, this is not going to be turn out well for the Americans at all. And in fact, that was right after September 11th, and I would tell people that, and they said, "Why don't you want to fight the terrorists?" And I'm like, "Well, because you're going to lose." Because it didn't work for the Soviets, it didn't work for the British, it didn't work for Alexander the Great. No reason to think it would work for the Americans, and it didn't. But I've actually had interesting conversations about this with veterans of the Iraq War, veterans of the Afghan War, and one thing that they will frequently point out is that they were in circumstances like that, you never knew when somebody was just going to set off an IED where you were standing. In fact, one thing that I started noticing some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, was I was seeing an unusually large number of young people out in public, like at the store or somewhere like that, with amputated limbs. That just dawned on me one day. I saw a young woman in a store with an amputated limb and an artificial leg. And I started thinking, I've seen a lot of this lately, young people that seem like they shouldn't have those kinds of injuries. Then it dawned on me, well, they're war veterans, they're veterans of the war. And I mentioned that to someone I knew who was actually an officer, a colonel in the Army, and she said, yeah, that's exactly what they are. But what the Iraqis and the Afghans did was they managed to just take homemade improvised devices and turn them into powerful weapons. And it's something that they use to keep their opponents off guard. If you keep your opponents unrattled so they never know if they're going to die that day or not. Like I had a student once who told me that this person was in Iraq and she was saying, yeah, every day I would think, this is going to be the day. This is my last day. And it never happened, obviously. But you're keeping your, it's a type of psychological warfare. Obviously, if your opponent always thinks as an individual that their end is near, yeah. But they were able to do this. The Iraqis and the Afghans were able to do this just with very crude, improvised explosive devices. And of course, the Afghans have the advantage of the mountainous territory. But when the Americans invaded Iraq, Tariq Aziz, who was the foreign minister under Saddam Hussein, actually said that, well, look, the Afghans have their mountains, we have our buildings and our cities and all of that kind of stuff, so we're going to fight in urban guerrilla warfare, and we'll see how this turns out. And it didn't turn out so well. It's just like you were saying, the Americans were bogged down in urban guerrilla warfare in Iraq and mountain warfare in Afghanistan, and neither one turned out very well.
Yeah, no, I think this is the key question. These kinds of strategies can work if you're willing to be occupied for a decade or more and willing to suffer horrendous casualties. That's the question. I'm not sure, because generally speaking, Americans, even before we ran a global empire, except for the Civil War, we're not used to massive casualties. The American Revolution, 100,000 dead on all sides. That's including the British, the French, as well as the Americans and Patriots and Tories. So of actual Patriot deaths, it's, if 100,000 total, maybe 10 to 20,000 Patriot deaths. That's not a lot. The War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, again, not a lot. And since Vietnam rather, casualties have gone way down again. Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Afghanistan, we've been in Afghanistan for like 16 years, but I think we've only lost like 20,000 people. It's not a lot of people compared to other conflicts of similar duration, like the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan or the Indochina War with France and the Viet Cong. Now, but if you are willing to sustain those casualties, that is something that could technically work. Now, you've mentioned this before in other contexts, and we see this in Afghanistan, going back to the British invasion. The anarchists are going to have to get over their gun phobia. You're going to have a Second Amendment culture. The Afghans historically are a lot like the Americans in the sense that they love their guns. Like the Afghans, they love their guns. They have tons of guns. At the end of the day, as long as you have an armed population that refuses to be governed, people are going to get tired and go home. But it's at a tremendous cost, and the question is, can most anarchists bear that cost?
Yeah, well, I think that the first issue is to avoid as best as possible what you were saying, an occupation and something like that. It's theoretically possible to resist an occupation through guerrilla warfare, but you want to avoid that in the first place. You want to have a defense strategy that's oriented towards avoiding being occupied, not just resisting once you are occupied. And again, I think that's where landmines and submarines and anti-aircraft missiles and artillery and those kinds of things come in. But yeah, if you're talking about gun squeamishness by some contemporary anarchist, I don't really know what to say to that. There are those particular anarchists are a product of the culture they come from. It's and their own background and experience, which is this. They've internalized the standard, post-war Western, nanny state therapeutic culture, and consequently they've got this. Not all anarchists are like that. Not all left anarchists are like that. But there is a significant contingent that I think probably is like that. As far as guns in the United States, the gun culture is not going away. It's such a deeply ingrained part of the American history. The United States has more firearms in circulation relative to population than any country in the world. I saw some data a while back that said 43% of all privately owned firearms in the world are in the United States. And it's interesting how the left end of what passes for the left end of the political spectrum and the mainstream keeps pushing the whole gun thing, because they think guns are icky. Those people are typically urban, cosmopolitan, suburban, professional class people who are fairly, liberal-minded about a lot of things, but they think guns are icky, and all those, icky, rednecky country people that like guns. And although interestingly, the people who are most likely to get arrested for violations of gun laws are actually blacks. So that's interesting to consider. But and I think that's a real problem with the whole gun control argument is it has this strong class bias and race bias and stuff like that as well. But back to the point, though, I think that in the United States, if you have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people that have their own firearms, occupying a society like that's a problem. And that's an issue, obviously, in Afghanistan. There's a quote from one of the Japanese military leaders from World War II. It may be apocryphal. This may not be.
Oh, yeah, it's Yamamoto, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's the one about, we can't invade America because there's a rifle behind every blade of grass or something like that. But that's what he was, assuming that this is not just apocryphal, that's what he meant. He meant that, the Americans have so many civilians, they have such a large nation and so many people, and then so many of them have their own weapons and stuff like that. It would be very difficult to do a land invasion of society like that.
Yeah, exactly. I actually think that David Friedman is onto something. If you have a gun culture like you have in the United States, say during the Revolution, you would have a large body of organized militias. But like in the Revolution, we had to have the Continental Army in order to reliably put men in the field to confront the British. That would be the purview, since it's an anarchist society, of like PMCs or something, people that are privately funded to be professional soldiers, to be that permanent army. And see, here's the interesting thing about the American Revolution. George Washington was not a particularly good military commander. He lost a lot of fights that maybe he shouldn't have lost. But what he understood is that back it up. In naval warfare, there's an idea of a fleet in being. It's not meant to engage the enemy fleet directly. It's meant to be a potential threat that the enemy is always going to have to worry about. So George Washington understood that the Continental Army was an army in being. It was not an army that was going to go toe-to-toe with the British and defeat it in a decisive engagement, though that later did happen with the aid of the French. The idea was that the army would always be there as a thorn in the side of the British, always limiting their strategic options. And so even if Washington was defeated, he wouldn't surrender. See, the British would expect that, okay, we beat you in a battle, European-style warfare, you'd surrender, Washington's like, no, I'm not going to surrender. I'm just going to keep on running around the country until you finally destroy me. And they never could. And I think learning from these historical examples, the American Revolution, some of the Indian nations like the Sioux or the Seminoles who resisted U.S. expansion for a time, or even the Boers in the Boer War. Those kinds of things. This is one of the problems with anarchists. They don't like history. They don't look at any of the past. It's this retrograde, patriarchal, sexist, homophobic past. You got nothing to learn from it. But of course, if you don't learn from those things, then you're not going to know how to organize a society capable of resistance to a modern day state. And I think one more question to add is, a lot of times anarchists, with this question is brought up, especially with libertarians, they think about it from a purely political military point of view. But you mentioned deterrence first, and I think you're right about that. And another way to have deterrence first is to produce things that people think are too valuable to destroy. So, for example, like Southeast Asia or East Asia, like South Korea and Taiwan, have specialized in the production of electronics. And there's some reason to believe that is deterred a Chinese or North Korean invasion, because that would collapse the global economy if all these electronics producers were destroyed. China can really only invade Taiwan after it usurps Taiwan's electronics monopoly.
Yeah, well, it's having those kinds of deterrence can actually be helpful in the sense that if you are producing something of economic value that people want, they're not going to want to wipe it out because that's going to keep the supply from coming in. For instance, you have a lot of people who say, well, there's going to be a war between the United States and China eventually. I would be very skeptical of that, in part because the two countries are so dependent on each other economically. America wants China's cheap loans and cheap labor, and America's China's major export market. So they're not going to just run that into the ground. So having something that's of economic value in terms of trade or production. In fact, during World War II, one of the few nations on the European continent that Germany did not occupy was Sweden. And one of the reason for that, in part, was that Sweden was a major producer of iron ore that the Germans were heavily dependent on in military production. And that's one reason why they left Sweden alone. And Sweden remained neutral during the war. So they weren't pro or anti-German, but they continued their trade relations and all of that with Germany. And I think that's probably why, and it's not just me that thinks this, that's why Germany probably never bothered to try to occupy Sweden. It's because, well, they produce iron ore, we need that, and they're not bothering us, so what's the point? So that may potentially be a deterrent, having some kind of economic relationship that's of value. As another issue too, though, is I think when it comes to deterring invasions, you want the enemy to think they're going to get a fight if they try to attack, and I think that depends on having a society that's willing to fight. Now, that's a cultural thing. Whether a society inhabited by anarchists and dominated by anarchist institutions would be people who were willing to fight or not if they were attacked, I don't know. I mean, maybe so and maybe not. It probably would depend on a lot of other factors. But I do think, though, that having the reputation of being a society that will fight, like the Swiss are a good example. Anybody that attacks the Swiss knows they're going to get a fight. They may try to risk it anyway, but they know they're going to get it. Or, Afghanistan, the Americans and the Russians and others, they took their chances and the dice came up short, but, I'm sure they knew they were going to get a fight, or were thinking they were going to get a fight. But again, that gets back to cultural questions and social questions. And I think that's one thing that a lot of libertarian thinking in particular misses, because they're so into this economic determinism thing. And that's true of a lot of the left type anarchists as well, particularly those that have a very workerist, syndicalist, almost Marxist type of outlook. But I think culture, as much as anything, shapes this. And we see that with the jihadis. What motivates the jihadis? Religion and ideology, not their class position or their pocketbook or something like that. That wouldn't go very far if that was the motivation. What motivates them is what they believe in. Say what you want about their beliefs, but they take it seriously. So I think that's a cultural deterrence, cultural incentives to defend a particular society, which in turn turn into deterrence from attacks by others are important too.
Yeah, because the thing with deterrence is you don't actually have to be able to win a war of people's liberation. You just have to raise the cost high enough that the other side is like, well, if I invade you, I'll lose X amount of material and manpower and money, and it's really worth what I'm going to get out of you once I take it over. And that's how deterrence works. Switzerland, could the Nazis have conquered Switzerland? Probably. But what did Switzerland have? Not much, and the cost of taking it would have been far more expensive than what it was worth, and so they didn't do it.
Both Switzerland and Sweden managed to retain their independence and their neutrality during World War II. They were the only two countries on the European continent that weren't occupied by Germany. That counted for something.
Well, exactly. So I'm thinking we're about at the end of the hour. So is there anything you want to leave us with on the hard question before we wrap this up?
Well, one thing we really didn't touch on much is how do you keep the anarchist defense forces from becoming the state, a new state? That's really, I think, one thing that is a crucial issue in this. And I think that in terms of organization, we have some models we can draw on from the mainstream society. If we look at all the different kinds of institutions and organizations that exist in mainstream society, we see that there are large organizations that are non-state entities and where their funding is de facto private, or that's corporate welfare and all that. But you have something like, say, the AFL-CIO, which is a large organization of labor unions, or you have the National Council of Churches, a big organization of lots of different church denominations, including some that don't agree with each other, and the National Association of Manufacturers, businesses, some of whom are competitors. So I think that the defense forces, if a functional stateless society that had an actual deterrent to external invasion would probably have something like that for defense. You might have the national, or whatever you want to call it, continental or regional or whatever, peoples or council on defense, and it would largely be an assembly of defense organizations, some of which might actually be organized by other types of institutions, by cities, by communities, by unions, by businesses, by cultural institutions or religious institutions, fraternities or whatever, clubs. But you'd have to have something. I don't know what you'd have to have, but preferably you would have something like that for defense. You'd have, in fact, Diego Abad de Santillán, he was an economist, a Spanish economist, who prior to the time before the Spanish Revolution, during the Civil War, he had actually written about this. He actually wrote a book called After the Revolution. And one of the things he actually talked about was the idea of a council on national defense. He had this idea of workers' councils for different industries and being a syndicalist. But he also said that one of the industries would be the national defense industry. And he envisioned something kind of like what I'm talking about, at least as far as if I read him correctly, and that is you would have this kind of national assembly of defense organizations organized by other institutions like the workers and the communes and all that. But it wouldn't really be the state. It wouldn't have taxation power, it wouldn't have conscription power and all that. But it would be something that was organized for this common purpose of defense. So probably something like that would be, your National Defense Council, comprised of all these militias and guerrillas and mercenaries and paramilitaries and privateers and terrorists or whatever, perhaps organized by all these other social and institutional sectors and economic sectors. That would probably be the organizational model that would be the most effective. But then there's a question of, well, when does this spill over into being a state? Well, when they start imposing taxation, when they start imposing conscription, things like that, when they start using their resources for things other than defense, when it becomes to, what's commonly called rent seeking and economic terminology.
All right. Well, thank you again, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.